out of the Middle East and into the rest of Africa. And we'll make that transition with one more Arab descent leader that spans both of those regions, from northern Africa, the Middle East, to Sub-Saharan Africa, and spans the regions in more ways than one. And we'll talk about his newest neighbor at the same time. The president I'm talking about of Sudan is one Omar al-Bashir. I know it sounds already confusing. Didn't I say Bashir earlier? No, I said Bashar al-Assad is the guy in charge of Syria. Assad in charge of Syria, dictator, okay? Omar al-Bashir is the guy in charge of Sudan. He's also a dictator, though. It's easy to remember. So I said he's a kind of a transitional pivot figure for Africa, in that Sudan's a really big country, but it's in the northern part of Africa, so he is actually ethnically Arab and religiously Islamic of the Sunni variety. So he has a seat at the Arab League. That ethnic religious mix, Arab, Sunni, really defines most of North Africa and makes it quite different from the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa. So right there on the line is Omar al-Bashir. And Sudan used to be a bigger country, but it split into two because it was so different from north to south. Arab and Sunni up here, and more black, African, and Christian down south, which is why they had to have several civil wars and millions of people die over the course of several decades before they said, you know what, we're going to split into two separate states. You guys go that way, we'll go this way, based mostly on ethnicity and religion. Bashir is the guy who is still president of what's left of Sudan. He oversaw the last stage of civil wars and that thing called Darfur. You ever hear about Darfur, where maybe a genocide occurred, a government-sponsored genocide that maybe Bashir allowed to happen or encouraged? Yeah, I bring that up because he's the only active head of state, first sitting head of state ever that's been indicted by the ICC. The International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for his arrest years ago on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. If he ever sets foot in Europe, he'll be arrested. Maybe in America too, I don't know. But he's largely stayed in Africa since that charge was levied on him. The only active head of state with a warrant out for his arrest because of what happened in Darfur and all these other places. Now, that's him up there. And by the way, he's been in power for a couple decades. A very typical thing for North Africa as well in the Middle East. Conservative, right-wing, Islamic, and by right-wing I mean politically, not necessarily religiously right-wing. He's more it's kind of a one-party state / dictatorship. I don't even know if they pretend to have elections. I think they do, but it doesn't matter. He's been in charge for a decade or three. I should say 2 or 3 decades. And that's typical across the Middle East. Sometimes typical in Sub-Saharan Africa too, but let's get down to his newest neighbor, that is the part of Sudan that they let go and form a new state back in 2011, and that would be South Sudan. Now, the guy in charge of South Sudan, here he is, one Salva Kiir. So the interesting thing about Salva Kiir is not that he has particularly done anything of note, it's just he's got some awesome 10-gallon cowboy hat wearing skills for starters. And he has been in charge of South Sudan since their inception. And really the only thing that's been happening there that kind of mostly defines his rule is the state has mostly been corrupt, had tribal ethnic competition within the new state that has kept it poor, chronically chaotic since its inception back in 2011. It's a fragile state that everybody's keeping their fingers crossed can even continue to exist because there's, again, fighting factions for power within the state and where they were poor to begin with when they became a state, and it's just kind of a mess. And that typifies the rest of our transition to the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, in that most Sub-Saharan African states, unlike those in North Africa and the Middle East, most Sub-Saharan African states are fledgling democracies, or full-fledged democracies, but many of them are what we still call the new democracy category. Now, when we say new democracy, South Sudan is obviously a new democracy. They've only been in existence for 5 years. But we say that lots of other states across sub-Saharan Africa and the world would still be in fledgling or new democracy status, not because of their age. It's more about, has the democracy really taken hold? Are they a mature democracy? And by that, we're suggesting that if the place is still mostly factional infighting, if who's in charge or who gets government post is mostly dictated by, are you in the right ethnic group, or you have the right religion, or are you getting these jobs passed out because you're friends with the family of whoever gets elected, that's a level of endemic corruption that counteracts the democracy. And maybe you have a lot of voting irregularities as well when you go out to have a vote. Maybe things just aren't right or ain't fair or totally corrupt. It doesn't matter if your democracy's been around for 5 years or 50. If it's still questionable about what's going on and that justice is being served equally and that everybody has a fair shot at it and it's a true democracy, if that stuff is not happening, then you're still in the new democracy category, even if you've been trying and you've been holding elections for 50 years. My instinct is South Sudan is definitely in the fledgling democracy category because it is truly new, but they'll probably still be in this status decades from now, unless something radical occurs. That's why I wanted to point out Salva Kiir, not so much that I think you really need to know him, although he does pop up in the news quite a bit. It's more that I want you to understand the challenges that Africa faces when it comes to political systems, because most of them are counted in the democracy category. Democracy is the trend, though, even if it's fake, even if it's fledgling. So now let's look, along with some interspersed dictatorships here and there. Africa has a lot of states, by the way. The most states of any continent are in Africa. So there is variation, but democracy is the trend. Now, let's look at some other African peeps of some democracies that you've probably heard of. If not, you're going to know a few of them. There are some good, well-established democracies in Africa. We'll start with perhaps the most famous one, probably the only place in Sub-Saharan Africa you even know, and that is South Africa. South Africa is the state. Sub-Saharan Africa is the region. Don't make the mistake of calling South Africa a continent. Africa's the continent. South Africa is a sovereign state. Which one of these two dudes is the president of South Africa, the most perhaps famous country of Africa? Well, one guy, I bet you said, I know that guy. It's Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela's president of South Africa. Well, no, he was the president of South Africa. The other guy is currently the president of South Africa, and that's one Jacob Zuma. The dude that you know, probably the only African leader you've ever been able to recognize, Nelson Mandela. Yeah, he's a super great guy, but he used to be the president of South Africa, and before that he used to be a prisoner of the government of South Africa for many decades, which is why he won the Nobel Peace Prize and helped end apartheid and all that stuff, and he's super famous. But he's now super deceased. So not only is he not the president of South Africa, he's not any longer with us here on planet Earth, and he is a borderline canonized saint. So he's an important dude to know, and I'm glad you recognize him. But please recognize Jacob Zuma from now on as the real, current, now alive president of South Africa. Now, again, you didn't know who he was. So if you didn't know who Jacob Zuma was, here's what he thinks of you right now. Oh, Jacob, you didn't need to do that. The few things I want you to know about Jacob are that he's been in power since 2009. South Africa has been a full-fledged, mature democracy now for some time, since Nelson Mandela came to power, I believe, in 1994, when apartheid went away and it became an established democracy. Most of the last couple decades has been, or more, has been the richest economy of Africa. That's no longer the case, okay? But that's not the only reason to know South Africa or know about Jacob Zuma. He has been large and in charge since 2009, and he was and is large and in charge of the most popular political party in South Africa, and that's the ANC, the African National Congress. The ANC, my gosh, I mean, it's so super popular, it's like saying the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of America combined. Literally, South Africa is a democracy, don't get me wrong, but it's just a super important and super popular political party that has been in power. They've controlled the Congress, and and all the presidents of South Africa since Nelson Mandela were of this party. Nelson Mandela himself led the African National Congress after he was released from prison and then became president. It's that important of a political party to understand, to know, to get what's going on in South Africa. However, Jacob Zuma's tenure in the last 7 years has been kind of rocky. And he may be remembered not as the guy who led South Africa in the early 21st century. He may be remembered as the guy who oversaw the ANC, the most popular political party of South Africa, fracture and fail. And I don't say that lightly. Fail is too big of a word, but it's on the borderline of fracturing. And that's because right now, 75 or 80 or 85% of people in South Africa vote for ANC. That's why it's borderline a one-party state, but in a good way. It's just people really like this political party. It was the party of Mandela. However, in the last decade or two, it's really failed to live up to all of its promises. So everybody was elated and happy when Nelson Mandela became president and South Africa was finally equal and free. But most people are still mostly poor, and it hasn't really helped enough people on the ground, at the grassroots level. And so after a couple decades of the ANC controlling all of the Congress and the presidencies, one would think, hey, well, things have gotten better. No, they haven't. It's more equal society, let's say politically, but economically not so at all. South Africa's been hurting quite a bit, and not only that, but it's rife with corruption. So there have been many, many investigations going on, including on Jacob Zuma himself for corruption. And on top of that, other political parties are now starting to rally saying, why is everybody voting for the ANC? They haven't done anything for 2 decades. Yay, Mandela was great. Now it's time to actually do something and fix the society. So it looks like things are starting to teeter, and I've never done this before. Jacob Zuma he'll serve out his second term, and then he'll be replaced by somebody. It's not going to be any big chaos or coup or anything crazy is going to happen. But I've never done this before, but I'm actually going to introduce you to somebody who's not even in power yet, because I think he's going to be. I think you're going to hear more about this dude. And his name is Julius Malema. Julius Malema is a South African politician, and I believe he's like a congressperson now. He's always been in politics in terms of even being an African National Congress Youth League member for 4 or 5 years. And he was expelled from the party actually back in 2012 because he's become more of a leftist, more of an extremist, politically and economically more of an extremist. He's not blowing stuff up or anything as far as I know. But he's an interesting cat in that he's saying, hey, capitalism is fine. That looks great. It's worked really well for all the white people. However, I think that we should do more things like Latin America is doing. He probably didn't use that accent. But Malema is saying we should probably nationalize a lot of industries. We should take over control of the South African economy and use that money to benefit the people. Basically, trickle down the wealth in a more leftist fashion. Interesting. And he's gaining popularity. He's super young, too. I think he was born in 81. So he's super young, and he already has been elected to Congress. And then just last year in the kind of nationwide congressional voting situation, he got like 1% of the vote. And this is a guy who was nobody 5 years ago. So he's one. I've never introduced someone so early in the game, but I did the same for Vladimir Putin, by the way. I knew that guy was going places. Watch this Julius Malema. He may be a hot figure in South Africa, which may impact the rest of Africa, because South Africa is quite important as a leader of Africa in general. Now you know Jacob Zuma, the current president. Now you know Julius Malema, possibly the future president. And you know Nelson Mandela, because everybody knows Nelson Mandela, and he may be the only African leader you've ever known. And South Africa used to be the largest African economy, but it's not anymore. It's definitely its most developed state. But there are other players of note, other plays that you need to know in Africa. And I'm going to start with the giants, the big 3 of Africa that I want you to know. One of them you already got. Jacob Zuma, ruler of South Africa, the most advanced economy of all of Africa. In terms of diversification across the board, it's a well-balanced economy, although it's not doing great. And wealth disparity has been increasing, so that's why they're in trouble. But it's still quite important. Whoever leads South Africa is looked to as a leader of Africa in general. Okay? Here are some other biggies you need to know, though. Muhammad Buhari is president of Nigeria. Nigeria is now Africa's largest economic power. It's got the biggest GDP, the biggest economy. Right, Nigeria? What, you didn't know that? Now you do. It also houses the biggest population of Africa. Boom, boom, it's a double biggie. Nigeria is actually a really important power player in Africa. It also is one of the biggest producers of oil in Africa, and I believe a top 20 oil producer on planet Earth, a lot of which gets exported to the United States and Europe. That's important too. So whoever's in charge of Nigeria is actually now probably as important, if not more important, than the president of South Africa. And the current guy is Muhammadu Buhari. Now, he's an interesting cat in that he is a northerner, and in Nigeria, what that means is much the same way that all of the African continent is kind of split, as I've now mentioned, and the north is kind of mostly ethnically Arab and Islamic, and the south is mostly ethnically Black African and Christian. Nigeria itself is split, same way. So the north, it's not ethnically Arab, but it's mostly Islamic, and the south is more Christian. And Muhammad is a northerner, thus he is Islamic. But what's even more interesting about this dude is that he used to be a major general in the army. He was the 23rd child in his family. I don't even know why I remember that fact. 23 kids, and he was number 23. And he became a major general because it makes sense to me. If I was 23 kids, you could probably barely get enough to eat. So join the army. And he did when he was a kid. He became a major general, and actually back in 1983, he led a military coup in Nigeria and took over and became the president. So this is actually the second time he's become president. Now, he has said his presidency didn't last that long. I think another coup deposed him. But he's a fairly straight shooter, meaning he's kind of conservative, if not more conservative. But really, he's what we call an honest broker. He's never been accused of corruption or any misdoing. When he became president, he actually tried to instill like cultural laws, and there were harsh punishments for like spitting on the sidewalk or doing bad things in public. And conservatives in America would love this guy. He's like, yes, you should dress properly and not spit and not do anything and study hard. And that's the way this dude is. And again, former military, Islamic. And he has since said, well, I'm democratically reformed. Yes, I did a military coup back in '83. But I've seen the light. Democracy is the way to go. And he did get elected. And Nigeria is an established democracy. And he did get, with corruption, but established democracy. And he did get elected a couple years ago. And the other thing that's important about Nigeria, and this guy in particular, as a law and order dude, and an Islamic dude at that, is that he has become the biggest Boko basher, meaning you probably heard of this group called Boko Haram, a radical extremist Islamic group in northern Nigeria and in southern Algeria and other parts of that side of Western Africa, that has done horrific acts, including kidnapping school children, making them into suicide bombers, torching churches, killing Christians, killing everybody who doesn't believe in their path to righteousness, which includes purging all Western influences and purging all educated people, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, Boko Haram, it's been in the news a lot. A terrorist organization which actually pledged its allegiance to ISIS already. That's how cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs they are. But they have a really big presence in Nigeria, and there's been plenty of bloodshed between the Nigerian army and this group, and Nigerian civilians and this group. So as an Islamic guy, he's actually given more weight that he is conducting this campaign against an Islamic extremist group, and he's a former military dude at that. So super important guy. I do want you to know Buhari. Biggest economy, biggest population, fighting Boko Haram, major oil exporter. Nigeria has tons of problems too, but they're a very important state, increasingly important state of Africa in the decades to come. The last of the biggest category, the big three, is a guy named Joseph Kabila. You know, I don't even know if I'll test you on him because he's getting ready to leave power. This is the last year. He's supposed to be in power unless they change the Constitution and he stays in power, which African leaders have a tendency to do. But Joseph Kabila is in the biggest category because he is the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that is Africa's largest state. That's the big three. Most diversified economy, South Africa, the biggest population, biggest economy, Nigeria, the biggest state, Democratic Republic of Congo. He has also overseen some of the biggest wars that have been going on in Africa. I know you don't know anything about Africa. It's understandable. Hardly anybody does. But there have been multiple world wars going on in Africa over the last many decades that involved armies and rebels from 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 different sovereign states fighting it out over resources or ethnicity or territorial control or whatever. And many of those skirmishes have been conducted on DRC soil, and some of them still are today. There are armed insurgent groups from Uganda, Rwanda, and maybe a couple other places camped out in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo right now, along with a host of homegrown insurgent groups. It's a really big country. It's a really poor country. It's been really hard to keep it together. I don't even know how it still is together. Democratic Republic of Congo, actually, if you pulled it up and stuck it on top of, I don't know, let's say St. Louis, it would cover virtually the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. It's a gigantic country with a lot going on, and not all of it is really good. So Joseph Kabila, whoever's in charge of the DRC, has a tall order in front of them, and it could be that whoever's in charge next oversees a continuation of war / civil war, which sees the DRC get pulled apart because it's just too big of a place with too weak of a government right now. But I don't want to end on a bad note, although I probably will. For those that are interested in other African leaders that are interesting, let me finish up really quickly with the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah, I said the DRC's in some trouble, but Kabila, for his part, is probably a decent guy. Anybody in charge of the DRC is more likely than not to not succeed. It's just a challenging situation. And he took over from his dad, who was assassinated. So yeah, it's kind of a democracy, but he took over after dad got killed and just kind of got elected, so maybe it's more of a one-party state. Anyway, the good, the bad, and the ugly, just a few other leaders of note that I probably won't test you on, but I do want you to think about. And that is, let's start with the good. There's some good guys, really super good guys. You already know good guy Nelson Mandela. Yeah, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, ended apartheid, all that stuff. Have you heard of the president of Liberia, though? It's one Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She is freaking awesome. 24th and current president of Liberia, Sirleaf is the first elected female president both in Africa in general and Liberia specifically. So she's already broken the mold for Africa. We're still waiting here on our continent. She became president of Liberia in 2006, re-elected in 2011 because she's done a pretty good job. Liberia was a country in crisis, borderline civil war, run by a dictator, all sorts of nasty stuff happening across the borders. And she has done a lot to hold it together, even during the Ebola crisis, if some of you remember that from last summer. Held it together under very trying times, and Liberia's been doing a little bit better every year since she's been in power. She's also known for peaceful, nonviolent fight for women's rights and women's safety. And she is also a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2011 for all her efforts. So, super awesome female lead in Liberia. We'll stick with other leaders that are routinely thought of as pretty darn good. Let's go to Rwanda. This is Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda, and he was there during that whole genocide thing. Now, most of you weren't born for that, probably, but you probably saw Hotel Rwanda, maybe? And Kagame, during that genocide that occurred, I'll summarize, 2 ethnic groups fought it out, and one group started slaughtering and killing the other ethnic group. And Paul Kagame was in the ethnic group that was getting slaughtered. But he helped hold the country together and defend it as a member of the army, and then became the de facto leader once that mess got settled, wherein almost 1 million people got killed. And he has been elected twice ever since. And Rwanda has been doing famously under his watch. Economically been prospering, doing quite well, getting a lot of attention from the world, a lot of international investment. Friends with President Obama. Here he is chilling with the first family. And while most of what is thought about him is pretty positive, remember when I alluded already to the eastern side of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I said, oh yeah, well, there may be insurgent rebel groups from Rwanda and Uganda hanging out there. Yeah, Kagame is thought in general as really being a successful leader of Rwanda and well-liked by most on planet Earth. However, he's also kind of being charged with maybe inciting some of these radical rebel groups inside of the DRC. And he just kind of blows it off. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's another country. So overall, pretty good guy, but with some question marks around the support of rebel insurgents in other states. And having said that, now we'll get to the maybe not so good, maybe borderline bad. And I hate to say this because I'm sure that people from Uganda, most people think that this is an all right guy. And that would be the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni. Museveni, for the same charges I just levied against Paul Kagame, he also is accused of having Ugandan troops in multiple skirmishes and fracases across East Africa and maybe points further afield. And the reason I bring him up is he's not necessarily horrifically bad. There are a lot of other worse leaders in Africa, trust me, and the world. But he's one of those borderline leaders that used to be really good and is kind of going the way that many African leaders who hold on to power too long go. And that is, he's been president since 1986. So as soon as you start saying, wow, 30 years in power, he's one of the longest serving presidents on planet Earth. So is that a democracy? We kind of count it as a democracy, but now it's kind of more of a one-party state if one guy just keeps winning all the time. And as the years have progressed, he actually, I believe, helped save the country from Idi Amin, who was a brutal dictator. That's when he came into power, and he hasn't been able to relinquish power ever since. And people love him, so he's like, well, everybody loves me, so I'll just run for another term. Change the Constitution so that I stay in power and absorb more power to the presidency. And then it must be that I'm so awesome and people keep electing me because everything I think is right. And over time, what that turns into, especially for Uganda, is a country that's been doing pretty well as well, just like Rwanda next door. It has a lot of international attention, gets international investment. But he himself has become more conservative with age, socially, and maybe even religiously. And I've heard strange tales of like radical fringe Christian groups that send lots of missionaries over to Uganda. And that's one thing, and that's fine. Missionaries are fine. But in the last few years, he's become more kind of aggressively anti-homosexual. And they've now passed laws in Uganda which I believe make being homosexual a crime, perhaps punishable by death. At least I remember he was pushing for that at one point. And again, you start to get this more conservative sensation religiously and socially that it's becoming more of a closed society and he holds all the cards. And he's becoming more of a questionable character. Is the international community really supporting him? Because we used to, but now we're not so sure. And, that's what happens when you stay in power for 30 plus years and just don't let go. So Uganda's kind of a question mark with Museveni. And he's an older guy too, but you know what? I'm going to end with a completely ugly. And that is the only real African a-hole of note that this is debatable. Some people like the guy. But I say, yeah, no, this is not a good dude. And that is Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. Much like Museveni up in Uganda, Robert Mugabe started as one of the saviors of the country. He led rebel groups in the 1960s to fight against repressive white power and overthrow and throw out the colonial powers, which were the British at the time, I believe. Then that led into him becoming the head of his political party. By 1975, he became prime minister of the country in 1980. And he became president of the country by 1987. And under the early decade or two, or three, Zimbabwe was flourishing. They were looked to as a jewel down in southern Africa, on par with South Africa in terms of a diversified economy, international investment, a lot of mining going on, a lot of financial services going on. That was a really good place to go to in the 90s to invest or start a business. And then he just wouldn't stop being president. And by the 2000s, in a bid to consolidate power, because again, it's a pseudo-democracy, so people are going out to vote and stuff, and he started to slip in the polls in his third or fourth or fifth attempt at becoming president. And so in order to consolidate his power base, he formed a really bizarre economic policy, which was, I'm president of Zimbabwe, and I say, kill all the whiteys. All right. Really? He said, you know, all of the white people here are not native, and all of their businesses and all the lands that they own, they're not really theirs. They're intruders. They're remnants of the colonial era, so we should take all that back. Take it all back, kick them all out. And it's one, you know what? You can debate about that policy if you think it's fair or not, or if it's reparations, or it's appropriate for a former colonial power to do it, and we can have that debate. But we should debate about it, and then talk about it publicly, and then maybe have some policies. This is a guy who just said, go for it. And what this turned into was just a debacle economically for Zimbabwe. Again, you can appreciate the policy, you can support the policy, you can like the policy, you can hate the policy, but no matter how you look at it, what he essentially did was flush Zimbabwe's economy down the toilet in the early 2000s. Because of this, there was attacks against white business people, white farmers, confiscation of white-owned lands. They pretty much drove people out of the country, even if they were third or fourth or fifth generation born Zimbabweans. And more importantly than that personally is that international investment just disappeared. People are like, whoa, not building a Nike factory there. You can forget that. International loans disappeared. Everybody overnight was like, yep, we're all done with that place, because who's going to go in there? And it's really been now over a decade since this self-imposed economic execution that the economy now is maybe worse than the average average African economy. And again, I said he was prime minister by 1980, president by 1987. He's still there. He again got infected with the power curse, the one true ring, as Bilbo would say. And once you have power, you can't relinquish it. This guy will not let anybody else win the presidency. He, of course, has stacked the deck. He has persecuted political opposition, controlled the press, ran people out of the country. And, of course, he wins every election by, 60 or 70 or 80% of the vote, because it's a one-party state / he's a dictator. He's 92 years old. He has no successor in place. So basically what you have is, again, a guy that started out strong, was well supported by the people, and then got corrupted by power, possibly greed, although there's never been any allegations that he stole a lot of money. Maybe he has. But just won't let it go. 36 years in power has been characterized by gross human rights violations, by gross negligence of the economy, and wealth disparity going through the roof. The inflation rate there a few years back was something like 17,000%, which means it cost 10 billion Zimbabwean dollars to buy a pack of gum. It's just out of control. And every time things get worse in Zimbabwe for the past decade, he has held fast and said, nope, it's all the outsiders' fault. It's all the West's fault. It's all the U.S.'s fault. It's all Great Britain's fault. They're doing all this. And it's one of the reasons why we put him on the list of dictators now. Again, many of his supporters say, no, it is the outsiders' fault. And that's fine. You can debate about it. But really, this one guy made Zimbabwe into a pariah state, much akin to, say, North Korea. They're almost untouchable. But he's 92. It can't last forever. And maybe Zimbabwe will rally after that. Okay? Sorry to end on a low note with 36-year run of a dictator in Zimbabwe. But enough of the mother continent for now. We've now gone halfway around the world, or most of the way around the world. We've done 4 continents down, 2 to go. We need to get to Asia, though, to finish this off. Let's jump way east now, into the east, or the far east, as far away as the Far East, and round up the policy shapers and newsmakers all the way to the Pacific Rim region, starting with the giants, India and China.